Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is invoking the Emergencies Act to deal with convoy occupiers in the country. Now, in this video, I will get to what this means. I will show you some examples in terms of how law enforcement treats this convoy versus how they have treated other sorts of protests or occupying forces. And also, I will get to both perspectives on this issue, both perspectives from a, human rights oriented perspective as opposed to a fascist perspective, but opinions that are both for this and against this. Now, let's first start by showing you, just to give you an idea as to why this convoy has not been dealt with the current powers that the government and law enforcement have, by using this as an example. Now, this is one example, but you can see many examples like this in my video. Yesterday, I showed you a clip of a cop giving a warning to a convoy member, telling him, "So you're not going to hit me with your car again, are you?" That's literally in the video. That's a quote from the video. One of the guys at his pickup truck, apparently ran into an officer multiple times. The officer let him go with a warning. Now, that's one example of showing you how soft they have been on these convoy individuals. But here's another. Here you have the Coutts police, this is in Alberta, greets and hugs truckers who have blocked the US-Canada border for 18 consecutive days. And I'm laughing because this is so absolutely ridiculous. Here is a quick clip of this. All right, that's as much as I could take. You hear in the background the national anthem. So that gives you an idea of as to why this has not been dealt with under the current powers that law enforcement have, because they are largely in support of what is going on. Now, as I've said in the other videos, this is no longer really about, vax mandates or vaccines, even though people that are in support of this still tend to think it is. But looking at the actual organizers of this convoy, their ties to far-right organizations, the eagerness here to try and funnel these people into a more far-right message, there's a lot more going on here than simply, health measures. But this shows you the approach that law enforcement has had. Meanwhile, the exact same province had a very different response to First Nation protesters. So Alberta's response to Coutts' blockade, proof of discriminatory double standard, First Nations say. When rail lines were blocked in 2020, Alberta Premier Jason Kenney drafted a new law in response, but it hasn't been used at the Coutts barricade. That leaves First Nations leaders ringing alarm bells again about racism in protest policing. So anyone that knows anything about Canada understands that when you have land defenders out there protesting against pipelines, for example, they come really hard down on those protesters, on Indigenous protesters. When it's this convoy, they hug it out. It's a direct, clearly a very different approach here, depending on who is doing the protesting. Also, homeless encampments, forget about it. This was in Toronto over the summer. I covered this as well. Here's a video. This is posted by Nahid Dasani. Here's a video of how people protecting homeless encampments were treated by police in Toronto last summer. See the difference. So I'll just play this. If you want a full video on this, I covered over the summer. I'll link to below the video on YouTube. But just, here they are tearing down homeless tents. Again, you haven't seen anywhere near this kind of enforcement when it comes to any of the convoy blockades. But and it gets worse here, and because of YouTube, I probably can't show some of the violence here, but it gets a lot worse again, very different approach here depending on who it is. And one last piece on this point, exclusive. This is from 2 years ago. Canada police prepared to shoot Indigenous activists. Documents show notes from strategy session for raid on Wet'suwet'en Nation's ancestral lands show commanders argued for lethal overwatch. Again, showing you the difference here. Now, this is why or how we have now gotten to this point, where Trudeau sees the Emergencies Act as the solution here, giving his government more power to try and move these convoy occupiers. So I'll link to the full act below if you really want to read through it. You know, it's kind of boring. So let me give you the quick summary here from the Washington Post. So the Emergencies Act gives the Canadian government broad powers and tools to respond to national emergencies. It's supposed to be a measure of last resort. It allows the Prime Minister and Cabinet to take special temporary measures that may not be appropriate in normal times, according to the text. It must be used only in an urgent and critical situation that seriously endangers the lives, health, or safety of Canadians or the government's power to protect Canada's sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity. So, has the Convoy reached this threshold to be able to enact the Emergencies Act? Well, that is a debate right now. According to the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, they have not met threshold necessary to invoke the act. But then you look at something like this. Mounties arrest 13 militant protesters after guns, body armor seized at Coutts blockade. By the way, yes, this Coutts blockade where they hugged it out. So when some of these protesters have guns and body armor, and recently there was another stash of guns that were stolen in Ontario that potentially may be involved in the blockade in Ottawa as well. I think this is maybe what has pushed the government to act, to push this Emergency Act, to use their powers through this Emergency Act. So, look, I think there's a fair argument on both sides here that the Convoy has not met the threshold because people are, sitting in hot tubs, in front of Parliament. They have bouncy castles for kids, like really, really stupid shit. But then you also have this going on, showing you that there are even more extremist elements within the Convoy that potentially meet the threshold for invoking the act. Now, in terms of what will actually or can actually be done with the act, this again from Washington Post, under the act, the government will be able to designate and secure critical infrastructure such as border crossings. Trudeau said police will also be given more tools to bring order to places, quote, where public assemblies constitute illegal and dangerous activities such as blockades. The government will also be able to compel individuals or firms such as tow truck companies to remove vehicles that have been blocking roads. The Federal Royal Canadian Mounted Police could be employed to enforce provincial and municipal laws. Now, the law enforcement aspect of this, again, I question how are you going to do that when, again, this has been largely the approach to this convoy so far. So I don't really understand how that part can be successful or would be any different under the Emergencies Act when this law enforcement has not been used successfully before this. But there's also another element to this, as CNN details here, saying financial institutions will now have the power to freeze personal or corporate accounts they believe are being used to fund the illegal protests, Freeland said. So this is the other aspect of it. They can essentially freeze the money that is being fed into this convoy occupation. So that is, I think, for them, a more successful route, again, from their perspective, in terms of trying to stop this. This is how I think they would actually be successful in doing so, is by eliminating their ability to even access any of their funds. Now, we get to the other perspective on this that says this is not a good idea, even if you don't support this convoy. So this from Nora Loretto in Passage, saying it must be said, use of the Emergencies Act isn't necessary to deal with the convoys. City tow trucks and bylaw enforcement are enough. Even moving the camps off of major arteries and isolating them into adjacent parks or parking lots could have been an option. In Windsor, Ontario, police could have removed the border blockade minutes after it started. Instead, it lasted for 6 days. We all know that any protest that challenged the legitimacy of the Canadian state wouldn't have been allowed to bring in bouncy castles or have children form symbolic chains to block off routes leading to border crossings. The convoys have been successful thanks to the help of police who have met these protests with indifference and even support. So even though Nora Loretto is arguing against using the Emergency Act here, she's also recognizing that law enforcement has not done anything. Again, leading to the question, well, what is the solution here? And I'll get to a potential solution at the end of this video, something I touched on in a video yesterday. But first here, The other perspective. This from Lee Carter, saying one of history's biggest lessons for the left. The capitalist state doesn't suppress fascists often. So when it happens, effing let it happen. Don't jump in on the side of the fascists. That, quote, first Hitler, then our turn shit has never worked. Quote, but if they can do it to them, they can do it to us, end quote. They're always going to do it to us, whether they can do it to fascists or not. Just be grateful to get a break from it for a minute. So he makes a good point. Now, if you want to argue whether or not these are fascists, whatever, that's beside the point here. We're talking about the state finally cracking down on these occupations that have been destroying the lives of people that live in these areas. Now, when it comes to the impact on the economy, I don't care. I don't care at all. Like, that's part of any protest. If you're going to protest, any successful protest is going to have an impact on the economy. That is whatever. My main concern is the impact on the families in these areas where they can't live their lives at all for weeks on end because of the illegal behavior of this convoy in specific instances. It's also worth, before I go on here, it's also worth noting a few things about this Emergencies Act. So it can be revoked within 7 days if the House of Commons or the Senate votes against it. And regardless, it expires after 30 days. It also requires a public inquiry to follow to analyze whether or not it was invoked properly, whether it was used properly. It's also geographically targeted, so it's not just widespread use of it. It's in these specific areas where there is issues going on. Also, they are not using the military, even though with this act they apparently can, but they are deciding not to. And they are not overriding the Charter of Rights and Freedoms by using it as it is. It operates within the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, so it's not a legal issue in that sense. So there are still limitations. Again, if Parliament says, "Hey, we don't want this," they're then forced to revoke it. But it doesn't appear that will be happening because the NDP are supporting the Liberal Party in this instance. Now, more reactions here. So from Christo Avalis, very telling that even with the Emergencies Act, the convoy will experience less force than the G20 protesters or Indigenous land defenders. Great point. That again, they did not need the Emergencies Act to deal forcefully with these groups the way that they will with the convoy. And even then, it's not going to be in a forceful way, the way we saw at G20 or with Indigenous land defenders. This from Tyler Shipley saying, I can appreciate that people on the left worry about the precedent set by the state invoking extra powers against the convoy because these will be used against the left. But guess what? The state already authorizes the RCMP to use lethal force against Indigenous land defenders, which is a point I just made. Last thing here, or a couple last things. Also argued here by Nora Loretto, how this Emergency Act could have been used to actually benefit us during the pandemic, which I find to be a very interesting and persuasive argument here, saying, as we curbed our activities, governments did the absolute bare minimum to support us. The federal government could have invoked the Emergencies Act to create more hospitals, harmonize vaccine mandate protocols, or to collect better COVID-19 data so we could actually understand what was happening. It could have invoked the legislation when Alberta was running out of oxygen, when Ontario and Quebec were storing bodies in cold storage facilities, or when long-term care facilities looked like war zones. They also could have sent us support when we needed to isolate, provided more paid time off work, and distributed free rapid tests. They could have helped us navigate this terribly difficult time with more mental health services. Instead, they told us that the power to stop this pandemic was in our hands, or could be injected into our arms, and that once we got vaccinated, it would all be over. This promise was a lie when it first started being made in November 2020, and it remains a lie today. Canada's high vaccination rate is something that we should be proud of, and it has stopped tens of thousands more Canadians from dying, but it was never going to be enough to end the pandemic. So, great, fantastic points being made here. This could have been used to actually help Canadians through this pandemic. Instead, it only gets invoked to stomp down on protesters. So, just something worth keeping in mind here, that this pandemic was not our fault as individuals, as citizens. The government could have done a lot more to actually help us through this by invoking something like these sorts of powers that they did not do. Last thing here. This is the potential, one of the other options apart from, the Emergencies Act to deal with this convoy, and that's counter-protesters. Now, obviously, the issue here is lack of fundraising, is the lack of people willing to put their bodies on the line, get out there and actually stop the convoy or try and break up these blockades. And also, counter-protesters don't have the ability to just, tow away hundreds of trucks. So there's limitations on power there, on our power as citizens to deal with this convoy ourselves. But it's worth pointing out that if it were well-funded, this could potentially be one of the solutions to dealing with this sort of occupying force. But that said, this is a complicated issue. I don't think there is any clear solution here. I understand the government's desire to go this route based on the lack of enforcement we have seen thus far. That said, it doesn't mean it's the right solution. But also, this is not going to set a new precedent to, come down hard on the left or on Indigenous protesters or on environmentalists or Black Lives Matter. These sorts of tactics have already been used. A lot more has already been used on those sorts of protesters, on left-wing protesters. They will not do the same with this convoy. So that's why there is this void. That's why there's this desire for the Prime Minister to do more, and he's answering that call by doing more, which is too much for some people. And I understand that argument. I understand both arguments here. And honestly, this is a issue I still don't have a clear perspective on. I don't know who is right. Both sides make great points. I understand both sides. Ultimately here, something has to be done. And this, at this point in time, is what the government is deciding to do.